Here we go. So this is a book launch. This is kind of not an official format of the cluster, but we've been doing this, and I think it's a great idea to give members of the cluster the opportunity to present their work, particularly if it's so well related to our overall research agenda. So, Cristóbal, we are extremely pleased that you have agreed to present your new book. You will tell us about it in a minute, so I won't introduce the book. So I would like to thank already Jan-Werner Müller, who agreed to be a commentator. I will also add a few of my thoughts on this extremely interesting book, and then we open up for a general discussion. So without further ado, I suggest you start, Cristóbal, telling us a little bit about the book, and then Jan-Werner will follow with his comments, and then I will add my 2 cents.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Let me start sharing screen. I hope that this works. It's here. So everyone is looking at the same than myself, or so okay, thank you very much for the invitation, Tanja, for presenting that here at Scripps. It's an honor for me as a fellow at Scripps, although in a virtual manner, of doing this presentation. This is a book that I have been working on with my friend and colleague Tim Bale, which is called, as you can see here, Writing the Populist Wave, Europe's Mainstream Writing Crisis. It's an edited volume. As you can see here, this is the picture that we selected for the book. It's coming out with Cambridge University Press and should be out now in July. And I will try to do today in the next 15 minutes is to give you an overview about which are the main ideas and arguments that we developed in that book. And as I mentioned before, it's an edited volume, so please don't think that I'm extremely smart. I have a lot of very good friends and colleagues who have written very good chapters. So many of the ideas that we'll present here, and based, of course, on some of the arguments that I have developed with Tim, but many of them are also related to the very good chapters included in that volume. So the presentation today is structured in these 4 points, although to be honest, I might stop in the point 3 just for reasons of time, and we might discuss the point 4 probably during the discussion. So first I want to talk about why should we care about the mainstream right? And I think this is a very obvious question, but it's a relevant one. And I want to argue why we need more research about the mainstream right in Europe, but probably beyond. The second part of the presentation is on concepts. So how do we define the mainstream right and other families of right-wing political parties in Europe? And the third part is a sort of theoretical framework that we develop in our book. And this is about the tension between the so-called silent revolution versus the silent counter-revolution. And as said, I have prepared something very short on the findings, but I think we can probably skip that just for reasons of time, and we can discuss it in the Q&A, depending on how long I will talk. So let's go to the first part, and this is why should we care about the mainstream right? And most of you are familiar with the debate in Western European politics, and you will realize there are 2 topics that are generating a lot of headlines. And these are, on the one hand, the decline of social democracy, and on the other hand, the rise of the populist radical right. But we have very few studies and interest in the current situation of mainstream right parties in Western Europe. And I will just present 2 pieces of evidence to reveal that this is a bit of a puzzling situation. So we have collected data on the electoral results in national elections for all right-wing parties in Western Europe since the 1980s till 2019. And we just present the average here. And if you look here, so we have the Conservative family, the Christian Democratic Party family, the Liberal, and we include also the Populist Radical Right. And if you see that figure, it becomes very clear, first of all, that the Populist Radical Right has been able to establish itself in the electoral arena, going from roughly a bit less than 10% to a bit more than 10%. And it's a line that slowly goes up. Second aspect that is quite interesting is that the Conservatives and Christian Democrats have declining support. And this is very, very clear for the Christian Democratic Party family. This is the red line that you can see here. And finally, the Liberal Party family has a very stable electoral situation, which is interesting by itself, and I will get back to this later. By contrast, if you look to the other side of the coin and you look at support for left-wing parties since the 1980s in Western Europe, and here we put evidence for social democratic parties, the Green Ecologist Party family, and the radical left, you see here two important findings, I would say. The first one is that the Green parties, and if you compare with the other figure, are going up, but are less successful than the populist radical right on average, so to say. Of course, they are similar, there are differences within countries, but on average, they are less successful than the populist radical right. And the other issue that is quite interesting is that social democracies are going down, but this is a very abrupt phenomenon that started in the last decade, so to say, and this is probably related to the ending of the third way politics of Schroeder and Blair. And finally, if you compare these two graphs, the figures 1 and 2, it's very clear that both social democratic parties and Christian democratic parties are losing electoral ground across of Western Europe. Having said that, what it's the main puzzle for us is that it's very clear that mainstream right parties are playing a major role across different governments in Western European politics, but we have very limited comparative research about these parties. We do have very good research about individual case studies, for example, the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, but we don't have books or research trying to compare these different mainstream right parties across the region. So how can we explain this research gap? And there are probably two reasons for that. The first one is what I will call ideological bias. And I think that most scholars, including myself, tend to identify much more with social democratic parties or with progressive forces. And because of that, we don't want to do research on those parties that we are not very interested in. But secondly, I think that many scholars also do research on those parties that they really hate. And this is the populist radical right. And this is why many scholars, including myself, do a lot of research about the populist radical right. But again, they tend to forget the other side of the coin, which is mainstream right parties. And the second argument that I think it's probably more important than ideological bias is that the declining support for the mainstream right, and remember the figure that I presented a couple of minutes ago, has been much more gradual than the electoral decline of social democrats. And I think that makes a huge difference because everyone is aware about the difficult situation of social democratic parties, because if you remember the line, it went down very, very abrupt. But if you think about mainstream right parties, it has been a much more gradual development, including, for example, the German case studies that I'm sure that most of you are familiar with. So finally, why should we care then about the mainstream right? And why do we need a book about that? I think there are many reasons for why I think that a book of this type and research on the mainstream right is relevant. First of all, I would say that mainstream right parties are normally the backbone of national governments in several Western European countries. And this is one of the reasons why we need more research trying to understand the similarities and differences between these parties across the region. The second aspect that is crucial, and we'll get back to this in a second, is that the current and future state of liberal democracy in Western Europe depends to a great extent to the behavior of the mainstream right, and particularly how do they relate with the populist radical right. And here, of course, Trump would be the counterexample if you think about what happened in the United States. So Biden is now the president, but it's an open question what will happen in the near future. So let me go now to the second part of the presentation, and this is part of the framework, and this is about the conceptualizations that we offer here. So first of all, let me try to present very briefly how do we define left and right politics, and I think for most of you this is very familiar. We follow the classic approach of Bobbio, who tell us that the right is a political ideology, which is characterized by the belief that the main inequalities within society are natural and largely outside of the purview of the state. This is a standard definition in political science, but what is pretty interesting is that if you go back to the classic book of Bobbio, he emphasizes that these natural inequalities can be either on the socio-economic camp or on the social-cultural dimension. And again, this is pretty important because when we conceptualize mainstream right parties, it could be that these parties can be right-wing on one dimension, in the other dimension on these two dimensions. And this makes the classification of these parties a bit more complex and at the same time, I think, more interesting, so to say. So if we apply that sort of conceptualization, what we do in our book it's first of all to make a distinction between two big camps in the political space, and this is the mainstream right versus the far right. So how can we distinguish between these two different camps? And if we think about the mainstream right, there are two issues that are very important to consider. The first one is that mainstream right parties normally tend to adopt this right-wing ideology that I presented before based on the definition of Bobbio, but when they defend these ideas, they tend to adopt moderate programmatic positions. And the second aspect that I would say is even more relevant than the previous one is that the behavior of those parties is characterized by being loyal to the political system. This means they're in favor of liberal democracy. And when I'm speaking here about loyalty, I'm using the classic words of Juan Linz and his classification about the relationship with the political regime. If we think by contrast about the far right, is the mirror image, if you want, of the mainstream right. Because on the one hand, far right parties tend to adopt radical programmatic positions when defending right-wing ideologies. And the second aspect that, again, I think it's even more relevant than the previous one is that their behavior is a semi-loyal or disloyal political actors. And this means are either against the liberal democratic system or they're against democracy per se. So if we want to further specify that, what we do in our book is to identify different party families within each of these camps. And we talk about Christian Democratic Party family, the Liberal Party family, and the Conservatives. I don't have time now to specify the characteristics of each of them, but we do that in our book. And we do the same for the far right. And here we identify two different political party families. On the one hand, the populist radical right, and on the other hand, the extreme right, so to say. And again, in the book, we provide more analysis about the characteristics of each of these party families. The last point about the conceptualization. We in political science, we love to develop that sort of frames in which we can try to put our different cases into boxes, as I'm putting here with the different symbols that I have. So we say that CDU in German is a Christian Democratic Party and the Lega Nord is a populist radical right party. But what is important to keep in mind is that parties can change over time, and it might be possible that they move from one category to another category. Just think about the following example, and how should one classify the Republican Party in the United States during and after Trump? I'm not an expert in the United States. I think that Jan-Werner Müller knows probably much more about that than myself. He knows the US from within, so to say. But my feeling is that we cannot classify the Republican Party as a mainstream right party anymore. And my opinion is that probably started even before Trump. And this is important because normally we think that Christian democratic parties or liberal parties or conservative parties in Western Europe are mainstream right parties. But I think we need to be very careful when applying these labels, because it could be the case that we will see movements from these parties towards these other categories that we discussed in the book. Let me move to the third part and final part of the presentation, and this is the theoretical framework that we develop in our book, which is related to this argument of the silent revolution versus the silent counter-revolution. So again, I assume that most of you are familiar with these concepts, but I will present them very briefly. If you think about the silent revolution, this is a classic argument developed by Ronald Inglehart decades ago, in which he argued that economic modernization, and he was thinking mainly about Western Europe, but not only, but this process of economic modernization leads to a process of cultural liberalization. And this is related to the expansion of what he calls post-material values. And he mentioned that as a silent revolution because he explained that this is a very gradual phenomenon. It took decades to observe this transformation of Western European societies towards the expansion of post-material values. And one of the outcomes of that is a rise of a new party family, and this is the Green Party family. On the other hand, we have the so-called silent counter-revolution. And this is the argument developed by Piero Ignazi already at the beginning of the 1990s, in which he says that he agrees with the argument of Ronald Inglehart, but at the same time, he adds something else to that story. And the argument that he develops is that precisely because of the silent revolution, there is a faction of the electorate within Western European societies that disagrees with the way in which society has been changing. And this is why he thinks that there is a space for the emergence of a counter silent revolution, so to say. This means the repoliticization of certain issues for very authoritarian and conservative voters. And this explains to a certain extent the rise of populist radical right parties across Western European societies. What is important here is that if you think about this debate between the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution, the main explanation, it's a cultural rather than an economic one. It's the cultural transformation of society rather than the economic one, the one that drives this transformation of the electoral space. So overall, the main argument that we develop here is that the emergence of the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution paves the way for this emergence of a new conflict space, which is marked by economic and cultural issues at the same time. And it's also leading to more political fragmentation and more polarization. And this is very, very challenging for mainstream right parties because they face a tension between, on the one hand, the need to try to please those voters who are in favor of liberal and progressive values. So to say, those who are in favor of the silent revolution, or if you want, the children of the silent revolution. And on the other hand, these parties try to and need to appeal to those voters who are in favor with the authoritarian and nativist ideas associated with the silent counter-revolution, so to say. And the main problem is that they cannot do the two things at the same time, because these are two different factions of the electorate, and trying to keep them together, it's almost impossible. I mean, the US is a different story because it's a two-party system, but if you think about Western European societies, which are characterized by multi-party systems, for a mainstream right party, these two revolutions implies a very, very big challenge. So last point, and with this I will conclude. So how can we observe these challenges that mainstream right parties are experiencing across Western Europe? And we develop here two additional arguments. The first one is that because of the emergence of these two revolutions, mainstream right parties across Western European societies are experiencing a very difficult trade-off between these three different dimensions that I present here. And this is the office-seeking dimension, the policy-seeking dimension, and the vote-seeking dimension. Briefly about each of them, the office-seeking dimension means maximizing control over political office benefits. The policy-seeking dimension, it's relating to maximizing impact on public policy. And finally, the vote-seeking dimension, it's related to maximizing electoral support. Finding the solution to these three different dimensions is always complex, but nowadays for mainstream right parties, this is getting extremely complex precisely because of these twin revolutions, so to say. And finally, we also argue in our book that the emergence of these two revolutions translates into four key policy challenges. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that these are the only policy challenges, but we are of the opinion that these are probably the four more threatening, so to say, to the mainstream right. And this is the issue of European integration, immigration, moral issues, and the welfare state. And what we try to do, and we have different case studies, they try to use the framework that I present here, and they try to explain variance across different cases. And finally, and I will conclude with that, as I mentioned before, this is an edited volume, and we included two chapters are large and case studies. So one looks at the demand side. This means that the transformation, looking at survey data about those who support mainstream right parties across Western European societies. And we have another chapters that look at the supply side, using mainly the party manifesto data to look the way in which mainstream right parties have been changing their programmatic positions. But at the same time, we include 8 case studies in our book. And as you can see here with the flag, these are the countries of Sweden, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Spain. So we are not able to cover the whole region, but we have a lot of variance in terms of Northern Europe, Southern Europe, and also smaller countries, bigger countries, and also what is quite important for us, great variance in the amount of votes that the populist radical right gets vis-a-vis mainstream right parties, and also when populist radical right parties were able to establish themselves in the electoral arena. And as I said, I prefer to finish here. I have a couple of more slides about more findings, but I think it's better to open up the debate and hear the thoughts of Jan-Werner and also of Tanja here. Thank you very much, and let me stop sharing now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cristóbal. I would have loved to hear a little bit more about the findings because you provided us with the introduction, which gives a very concise overview of the book, but doesn't really elaborate on the key findings. But I'm sure we have the possibility to get back to this issue. Now, over to you, Jan-Werner.
Yeah, I also got to say, I mean, I appreciate the dramaturgy of leading us to the cliff and saying, and now I could show you the main findings, but I'm not going to show them to you. I mean, are you sure you don't want to give us a little bit of a hint of the actual conclusions?
Or you have to unmute yourself, Cristóbal. I muted
we are
you.
in a democratic system. If people are in favor of that, of course I will say yes. So up to you, Tanja, you are in charge.
I look at the audience. I mean, they would you agree that we should give Cristóbal the opportunity to present some of his key findings? Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So go ahead.
So I will try to do it very brief. I will go back to the presentation. My apologies, and I will try to be very brief so that you have an idea about which are the things that we find out. Let me find. I think it's here again. Okay. So we are back here. So excellent. So about the findings, and I will try to be as short as possible here. So the first question in which I can try to give you some overview, it's to what extent the theoretical framework that we develop about this twin revolution works for all the different countries included in our analysis. And the first argument is yes, I would say, but there are important differences. And the differences are in part related to the timing of the consolidation of the populist radical right. The examples here that are very obvious are Austria and France, countries in which the populist radical right already arrived in the 1980s. This implies a huge challenge for mainstream right parties since more than 2 to 3 decades. And this is very different than the situation in a country like Germany, where most of you are, or like Sweden, where I am at the moment, because populist radical right parties are relatively new phenomenon in those countries. Nevertheless, there are 2 partial exceptions to our arguments. And the exceptions here are Italy and Spain. So why partial exceptions? If you want to understand the political conflicts in Italy and Spain today, I think that the 2 revolutions are very important indeed. But if you want to understand why the mainstream right parties in each of those countries is struggling or started to struggle, it's not related to the Twin Revolution, it's related to something very different. If you think about the Italian case, it's because of the collapse of the party system in 1994. You probably know that Italy had a very strong Christian Democratic Party that literally disappeared from one day to another because of the collapse of the party system. And that collapse of the party system is not related to the Twin Revolution, it's related to corruption scandals and other issues. And if you think about Spain and the situation of the Popular Party, I would say that the crisis of the Popular Party in Spain is related to 3 issues. That's the impact of the Great Recession, corruption scandals affecting the political system as a whole, but mainly the Popular Party and the Catalan independence movement. So this is the reason why the PP is struggling today, which again, it's not necessarily related to the twin revolutions. And this probably indicates that the framework that we are developing might work better for Northern European countries, or so to say, for richer countries within Europe, rather than for Southern European countries. And this is a general argument that also other scholars have been developing. And this is also interesting because it poses a question to what extent the theoretical framework that we develop here might travel to other places of the world beyond Western Europe. Think, for example, about Eastern Europe, or also myself, if I try to apply that to Latin America, I think we need to be careful about that. So second issue about the findings is, if you remember, I spoke about these 4 key policy challenges, and one of the questions that we try to answer is to what extent each of these policy challenges are equally daunting, or if some of those challenges are more daunting than the others. And then I will say something briefly about each of them. If you think about the issue of the European integration, our findings reveal that most mainstream right parties within Western Europe tend to be in favor of the European integration. There might be some differences between some of them, but most of them continue to support the European integration. And the UK here, it's really the exception. And the argument of the chapter on the UK is that Brexit Brexit is probably hardly be seen as something to be imitated. And this probably will reinforce the support of mainstream writers to the European Union, because the option of exiting, it's really a non-option, so to say, in part, and I think this is important, because the mainstream right in the UK, the Conservative Party, is still struggling to find its proper identity. So the problem has not been solved by exiting the European Union, and this will continue to be an issue for the Conservative Party in the UK. If you think about immigration, this is, of course, one of the most clear and, if you want, obvious findings, is that this is the most daunting challenge for almost all mainstream right parties. And in fact, the evidence for all the chapters that we have is that, and this applies to the single country case studies, but also to the large N case studies, that all mainstream right parties are adopting more restrictive positions. It could be the case that the COVID-19 pandemic gives less saliency to this issue, but I think this is an issue for the moment, because I think that probably we will return to a sort of normal life after COVID-19. And if this is true, probably the immigration issue will start getting more saliency again. And this means that mainstream right parties will need to confront that issue. Third point about moral issues. Something that is interesting here is that we didn't find a clear trend across the different case studies. In some cases, you see the politicization of moral issues by mainstream right parties. Some of those parties, in fact, tend to adopt more liberal positions on that dimension. Angela Merkel would be an example, or also if you think about the Tory party under Cameron, but in other cases, this is not necessarily the case. And this probably shows that the politicization of moral issues is much more related to national debates rather than to international or continental developments. And finally, related to the welfare state, it's again difficult to find a common trend across all the different countries that we included in the book. But one sort of finding we think this is depend a lot of how heterogeneous and at the same time how big is the base of support of mainstream right parties. If mainstream right parties still have a relatively broad coalition of support by the electorate, this means that these tend to be relatively heterogeneous, and this means that the party probably needs to be in favor of the welfare state. By contrast, if the mainstream right has a very small fraction of the electorate, it's easier for the party to adopt more neoliberal positions that will be in tune with that small fraction of the electorate, and this is what sometimes happens with liberal parties. Finally, let me go to the different party families now. So, and I will do now the exercise about thinking about how do these different party families have been dealing with the twin revolutions that I presented before. The first issue that I just want to reinforce is that it doesn't matter if we talk about the Liberal Party family, the Christian Democratic Party family, or the Conservative Party family. All these parties are taking and adopting harsher positions on immigration. Nevertheless, they don't necessarily are taking negative positions on other dimensions of the silent revolution. It's mainly about immigration. But if you think, for example, about abortion, gay rights, etc., depends on the parties, but there is no common trend. The only common trend is really about immigration. Now, if we think about each of the party families, in the case of the Conservatives, our feelings is that it seems that the authoritarian factions, or so to say, the factions that are in favor of the silent counter-revolutions, are the ones who are winning the battle. This is very, very clear in the case of the UK, and this is why the UK, at the end of the day, push for the Brexit option, but also for the type of policies that the party is developing at the moment. It could be that that might be replicated in other cases. I'm talking now from Sweden. I'm talking to different colleagues here. It seems like Moderata, the mainstream right party here in Sweden, is quite keen on building a coalition with the right-wing bloc, including the populist radical right. And this is related to the fact that the authoritarian factions within the party, so to say the factions in favor of the silent counter-revolutions, are the ones who are winning the battle. If you think about Christian democratic parties, it's very clear that there is an electoral decline. Remember how I started my presentation. But what is also interesting about this party family is that it's really, really interested in the office-seeking dimension, but this has as a cost the policy-seeking dimension and the vote-seeking dimensions. because remember, you cannot do these three things together. But what Christian democratic parties try to do is to stay in power. And when they stay in power, they mean that they probably dilute their policy-seeking dimension, and they also tend to have like an awkward position when it comes to developing a vote-seeking dimension. Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands are examples of that. And finally, when we talk about the liberals, there is huge electoral variance across the different liberal parties that we analyze. On the one hand, you have someone like Mark Rutte, that's what we will call a sort of a Satz version of the populist radical right, because of the sort of language that he develops, to someone like Macron in France, who is developing liberal positions on both the economic and the cultural dimension. But again, within the liberal party family, we see a lot of variance. And finally, and I will really conclude with that, what we think that it's problematic, it's something that we call the winning formula that many mainstream right parties are trying to develop. And that winning formula, and I put in here the figures of as you can see, of Boris Johnson, and you can see also Mark Rutte and Sebastian Kurz. And these are examples of politicians of the mainstream right who are trying to achieve the office-seeking dimension and the vote-seeking dimension, but at the expense of the policy-seeking dimension. And particularly in terms of liberal democracy, because what these leaders are giving up, it's the liberal component of the democratic regime. I don't think I will still classify them as mainstream right parties, but remember when I was doing my presentation that we need to be careful when applying those concepts. And if we travel in 10 years' time, and if Mark Rutte continues with that sort of approach, and the same with Boris Johnson, and the same with the Christian Democratic Party in Austria, there should be a time in which we scholars should be really careful about classifying those leaders and parties as mainstream right politicians. And this is why this is the dark side of that sort of winning formula, because it's a real challenge for the liberal democratic system in Western Europe. And now I hope that I was able to present some of the main findings in a very short fashion. Thanks again.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cristóbal. I think that really helped, particularly those, who haven't sort of as thoroughly read your introduction as Jan-Werner and I did. Okay, Jan-Werner, now let's get going with the comments.
Thank you. So I've actually had the privilege of reading the entire book, and I have 4 questions to Cristóbal, but maybe everybody can jump in if they wish, prefaced by 2 more general remarks. The first one is that this is a really important contribution for some of the reasons also that Cristóbal outlined at the very beginning. So by now, everybody knows about the crisis of social democracy, an outpouring of writings, both in political science, but also in political theory, many of which, with all due respect, I think simply tend to repeat what Ralph Dahrendorf already talked about decades ago when he diagnosed the end of the social democratic century. Plus, as Cristóbal also said, studies of populism of the radical right have become a kind of cottage industry. No self-respecting American university can nowadays do without a Center for Populism Studies. And especially if you happen to be concerned about the fate of liberal democracy, the massive blind spot is precisely the so-called center-right or mainstream right. And especially again in the United States, it should have been obvious a long time ago that the really weak point in the whole story is precisely the Republican Party, which, as everybody by now knows, has radicalized massively over the last couple of years, and which now, I think it's fair to say, in many ways, is actually an anti-system party. And there's a big question of, what to do in a 2-party system when one of these 2 parties has become anti-system. So, long story short, I think the general crisis of democracy discourse has partly suffered from precisely not seeing the importance of the role of the mainstream right / center right, and this book is extremely helpful in helping to remedy that situation. I add that beyond that, it's also really a model of how to do an edited volume. We all know what can go wrong with edited volumes, but I think this is really extremely well done in terms of finding the right balance between a strong conceptual framework on the one hand, and on the other hand, sensitive case studies that don't simply kind of homogenize particular national constellations, because, you know, of course, they kind of have to fit into the overall framework. So again, as many of you know much better than I do, actually, this is a really tricky balance to strike. And the book does this extremely well. So there's a lot to be learned, both in terms of the more general identification of trends, where, you know, Cristóbal revealed some of the main findings now in his presentation as well, but also in terms of learning about specific trajectories in the countries that you saw on the slide earlier on. Okay, let me move on to my 4 more particular questions that I had, both as a result of reading the book, and then also again as a result of the presentation. And they partly reflect, I should say, the fact that I come to this mainly as a political theorist. So I find it very boring if people, you know, endlessly say, oh, I'm not an expert on this, I'm not an expert on that, and here are the disciplinary boundaries, etc. I mean, usually I don't believe in these kind of prefaces, but some of the questions I want to pose are maybe overly shaped by somewhat different preoccupations than people in comparative politics might have. And basically, I will go from some of the more abstract concerns one might have to something that is more directly, maybe even crudely materialistic at the end. So the most abstract question I would have really concerns what Cristóbal called the policy dimension. My sense, but it could be very impressionistic and maybe empirically it's just wrong, is that apart from everything else, the so-called center-right, but especially Christian democracy, has suffered from a kind of programmatic exhaustion. I find it striking that, you know, for all the talk about the crisis of social democracy, if you ask people today, what is social democracy about, or what is socialism about, I think most people can give you some kind of answer. If you ask people today, what is Christian democracy about, I think people would be much more likely to struggle and to kind of identify a couple of core elements, let alone mainstream right or center right. So I think it's been a consistent trend that a lot of these parties cannot really identify clear principles or policies where they would say this is sort of our signature thing. And this might be slightly parochial, but you know, many of you know that just a couple of days ago, the CDU-CSU revealed its program for the September elections, and you know, things like "we are modernizing Germany." I mean, "we are modernizing Germany" was the slogan of the Social Democrats in 1969. So, I mean, yes, we all know that, you know, Christian Democrats were never very strong on programs. They were always selling themselves as we're pragmatic, we know how to govern, etc. Nevertheless, for a long time, there was often something more substantial than simply that kind of pragmatism. So I wonder how that, if at all, comes into the story. Second question relates to gender. So in a lot of countries, it was the case for a long time that women were more likely, certainly, to vote for Christian democratic parties, but also in some cases for conservative parties. And I wonder whether you have any findings on changes in this regard, whether that matters at all for some of the overall trends that you identify. If I may, just as a footnote / anecdote, again, in this country, many people have been asking the question, why did Markus Söder seem to change overnight? You know, from basically let's copy the AfD, let's be even more radical in our rhetoric, to, okay, I'm this soft guy who loves the environment, you know, saving the bees is my priority, and so on. And it turns out part of the answer is that the general secretary of the CSU, Alexander Dobrindt, apparently asked all his party colleagues to go to a private meeting, i.e. everybody else out, turn off your cell phone. And then he showed a PowerPoint presentation where he said, we are massively losing women to the Greens. And if we don't change that, and if we don't get, if we don't present a different image, we're going to lose in Bavaria consistently. So this it's just not a winning formula if we simply start to run after the far right. So I wonder if there's a more fine-grained story to be told about this aspect. That's the second thing. Third thing relates to the internal structures of these various mainstream right-wing parties. And the more specific question would be whether you think that attempts to basically erode intra-party democracy and to do what Kurz did in Austria, which is basically to say, I'm going to transform a relatively traditional party with, like it or not, relatively robust intra-party structures where, local barons had a lot of power, a lot of veto points for, old style sort of party bosses, to transform that into a supposed movement, whether that also plays a role in terms of the repositioning of some of these parties. So I can't prove this to you empirically, it's just an intuition, but my sense is simply that, once Kurz kind of pulled off this trick, it was also much easier to basically go for this hardline course where he essentially started copying the Freedom Party in all kinds of ways. And conversely, again, from a very parochial German perspective, many of us are still sort of asking the question, how come that Laschet won in the end and defeated Söder in this internal conflict? And one plausible answer seems to be that, well, the Christian Democratic Party here is still traditional enough in its structures, in also concretely giving a lot of power to kind of elder statesmen like Schäuble and Bouffier, such that when these people said, no, we're not going to accept a kind of hijacking by Söder, we're not going to also play this game that, the real people out there, the silent majority is in favor of this guy. So we're going to start ignoring all our traditional structures and institutional procedures. That still works in this context here, but there might be a different story about some of the cases that you looked at. And finally, here's the really crude materialistic question. So our mutual friend, Müller, has for a long time made the point that one of the major trends in Europe and maybe even globally to some extent is the mainstreaming of the far right. Not all its positions, but some of its crucial positions. And you, in a sense, also alluded to this when you said a lot of these parties have moved very considerably. I mean, mainstream parties have moved very considerably on the question of immigration. And furthermore, at least in some countries, a certain radicalization that has gone hand in hand with the mainstreaming of far-right positions has posed a direct threat to democracy. And the US in many ways is sort of exhibit A for this trend. Now, it also, of course, remains very different than some of the European countries that you analyze. So I'm not saying that the US is necessarily the future of Europe. But here's the question. Contrary to all these analogies, which tend to be drawn with the 1920s and 1930s, on one very basic level, it's not so obvious why the mainstream right really had the incentive to either radicalize or to basically be prepared outright to bring far-right politicians to power. And I would say up until today, at least, no far-right populist has come to power anywhere in Western Europe or North America without the collaboration of much more established conservative elites. Italy is a more complicated question because obviously the Lega Nord came to power with the help of five stars. Still, one wonders what actually happens or what would happen if these conservative elites really felt pressure. In other words, in the United States, for instance, up until today, nobody has really threatened them in a material way, right? So if you are a conservative, or if you are, to put it very crudely, big business in the US, you really had nothing to worry about for the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, this is the old story about how Clinton and Obama were obviously still part of a long-lasting neoliberal regime. And yet, despite that fact, the Republicans have radicalized massively. So what if one day somebody appears and actually starts to take away real stuff from some of these people? What's going to happen then? So I know this can sound like, the most vulgar Marxist kind of analysis, But I think it's important to pose the question: how innocent? I mean, I understand that you would say, look, you know, the material explanation is misguided because it's enough to have these more sociocultural developments, and people care about that too. So I get that, but I still wonder whether, you know, there isn't something more to be said that in a certain way might make us even more worried in a certain. Anyway, thank you for the presentation, for the book, and again, I would urge everybody to read the book. It's really worth your while.
Thank you, Jan-Werner. I mean, this is always the problem when you go after someone like Jan-Werner Müller. There's not much left. I have only a very, very, I would say, more comparative politic point of view, even more comparative politics points than Werner, and I try to be really brief because we want to have time for discussion. My first question is, I've not fully understood where you come down in this debate about the one versus the two-dimensional political space. You introduced the new cultural cleavage very late in the introduction at page 19, right? And clearly, it's been the result of the silent revolution. But I haven't fully understood how you come to terms with it, particularly when you look at your 4 challenges. 3 of them relate, I would argue, to the new cultural cleavage, and the 4th, welfare, is still the traditional one. And arguably, and this is what we find, at least when it comes to voting patterns in the European Parliament, the new cleavage, so the first 3 policy challenges divide the mainstream right, and to some extent, and increasingly, the mainstream left, right? So I think these 4 issues differ with regard to how they're related to new cleavage. So I wonder how you can, whether you can elaborate it. Second point, your far right category, the populist radical right versus the extreme right. Now, I'm not sure whether it was your paper or someone else's paper who showed that these parties mobilize quite different voters. The populist radical right mobilize voters who are disenchanted with liberal democracy, whereas the far right, the extreme right, mobilizes voters who sort of reject democracy altogether, right? I think there is empirical evidence, and so doesn't this make a difference, right? I just wonder. Third point, the silent revolution and the silent counter-revolution, the backlash against the silent revolution, I find very compelling, of course. I just wonder, I mean, these revolutions have been driven by other parties, right? Not by the mainstream right. And what about the so-called neoliberal turn, which a lot of people, you know, say has been another major driver of this, what you call the counter, you know, the rise of populism. So what about the neoliberal turn, which arguably has been driven by mainstream right parties? And 4th point, the scope of your argument. You already alluded or referred to the fact that your argument or your findings may hold more for the North as opposed to the South. I mean, Hans-Peter Grisi has written about, you know, that due to the different socio-economic modernization process, the silent revolution has been delayed and incomplete in southern countries, as a result of which the silent counter-revolution also plays out differently. I think there you're absolutely right. But I wonder what, again, sorry, I keep pressing you on that. What about Eastern Europe? I mean, how does Eastern Europe fit in there? Doesn't it make sense to work with the party categories you have developed, because they're so different because of the socialist legacy? I just wonder, right? Okay, so I stop here. Suffice to say that, of course, I fully share Jan-Werner's praise for the book, and it's going to make a big contribution to a very important debate. And now everybody gets ready, I can tell, to get into the discussion. At the same time, you have quite a lot on your plate, so maybe you want to work on some of the issues. Nobody will expect you to address all of them, and then we open up for one big round of comments, and then I suggest we give you another chance to respond and then see how much time is left. Okay, Cristóbal, here you go.
Okay, many thanks to both of you, Tanja and also Jan-Werner, for reading the book and preparing the comments, which are very stimulating indeed. And what I really like also about your comment is that You didn't stop into page 25 when you say that that happens, so much more the bigger picture that I think is an interesting debate about the project. So I will try to address each of the different aspects that you have mentioned, and I will start with Jan-Werner about the policy dimension that you develop, and the argument is that we see a sort of programmatic exhaustion of mainstream right party, and this is particularly the case for the Christian Democratic parties. And my feeling would be, say, I completely agree with you, and this is probably you see also in the way in which these parties, they sell themselves. And how they sell themselves is we can govern, that's what we can do. Which again is related to this issue, vote for me, because if you show in the past, if you look at the past, we have been able to deal with different things. I mean, this is the story a bit of Kohl and Merkel, for example, in Germany. I mean, this is a sort of language on how the party presents itself as saying, like, we have these strong leaders who have been able to master different situations. But if you really dig into the ideology of what the hell do they propose and which is the programs that they have, it's not very clear at all. And I think this is part of the problem that we try to emphasize in our book, because if they don't have a programmatic agenda, the ones who are really setting the agenda are the ones who are on the right side of them, so to say. And this is why this is a real problem, particularly if they're interested in building a coalition with them. Again, I'm talking from Sweden, and it looks very clear that Moderata is willing to build a coalition with the Sverige Demokrata. But probably if I ask the same question that Jan-Werner is asking, so what is Moderata standing for? People will say, I don't know, probably governing in a successful way. And people ask, what is Sverige Demokrata standing for? Everybody knows. So if you build a coalition between these two parties, everybody knows what will happen. It's about immigration. It's about that. But what else is going to happen? It's not very clear. And I think this is a crucial problem of mainstream right parties in general, I would say. Liberals might be a bit different, but probably we'll get in a second. But for Christian Democratic parties, I think that is very clear. The second issue that you mentioned is gender. And I think, of course, here it's difficult if you compare the evidence for the different cases. If you look at the large N chapter that looks at those who support mainstream right parties in Western Europe, it shows that the gender dimension tends to be relatively stable. So again, if you look at the big picture, large N data, it shows that the people, if you think women supporting these parties, have not been like several changes over time. Nevertheless, I think that to understand the problematic that you are mentioning, that I think it's a real problem, we need to understand the relationship between the mainstream right and the populist radical right, or the silent and the silent counter-revolution. What we know is that those who support the populist radical right are mainly men. Women normally don't vote for the populist radical right. And this means that for mainstream right parties, they are struggling to get men, so to say, because the very authoritarian men, so to say, it's voting for the populist radical right and not anymore for the mainstream right. And I think they feel that pressure. And again, finding the right balance for them, it's anything but simple. Because if they move too far beyond the silent counter-revolution, the silent revolution, sorry, they will lose even more men, so to say. And this is why I think that this gender dimension is really problematic for mainstream right parties in general, particularly when populist radical right parties have been able to establish themselves, to entrench into the electoral system, and to be able to get this 10 to 15 to 20% of the electoral base, and it's normally very stable over time. And this is a challenge for the mainstream right. The third point that you made, it's about intra-party democracy. And I think the argument that you developed stays very in line with the findings of many of the chapters. The chapter, for example, on Austria, it really shows that it asks this question of why is it that under certain circumstances, the Christian Democratic Party in Austria was willing to build a coalition with the populist radical right, and under certain circumstances was not willing to do it. And the argument of the chapter, and this is related to different factions within the Christian Democratic Party. To make it a long story short, they say you have two factions. One is that it's the liberal faction and the authoritarian. It's a bit more complex, but to make it simple, it's like that. And if you have a leader of the authoritarian faction that is able to win the leadership within the party, and at the same time, if the party is doing bad at the polls, then you have the perfect constellation. Because that authoritarian party will say, look, we are doing bad at the polls, and I'm representing the hardcores, those in favor of the silent counter-revolution, we need to move into that direction. But if I contrast, the person who is in charge of the party belongs much more to the moderate faction, and polls are not necessarily that dramatic, then the party will probably stick to the silent revolution rather than the silent counter-revolution. And think also about the example that you were saying about Germany. It's true that Laschet was able to win, but Merz was very close to win the battle. And of course, this is future, but I don't know what would have happened with the Christian Democratic Party if Merz will be able to control the party nowadays. I mean, we know that he's much more on the neoliberal side, but for me, it's not very clear what we will do if he would be the leader of the party with this sort of cultural dimension, so to say. It could be the case that you will say, okay, let's move much more towards anti-immigration. So in this sense, it's true, Laschet won the battle, but it was tight. It was very tight, and it has to do with how things evolve in the country, etc. And finally, the fourth point, and this is the Marxist Jan-Werner that pop up in the discussion, so to say. I think this is an interesting debate that in part relates also and connects with the argument of Tanja when she was saying, I say this argument that we have like these two dimensions, but at the end of the day, we say of these four policy challenges, three of them relates to the cultural dimension, only one of them relates to the material dimension. And this is how, till today, and I would say before COVID-19 times, we are thinking about the political space. Because the question about the state and the market has been solved, so to say, in favor of the market. And so, but I think this is probably changing. And again, I cannot do futurology, but it's probably changing because of the COVID-19. Because we are seeing now that all parties now are in favor of having much more stronger social democratic positions. And probably my feeling is that after the COVID-19 pandemic, the issue of inequality will become even worse than before. So in theory, this opened up the space for the repoliticization of the material dimension. And if this would be true, this means that the cultural dimension will continue to exist, but the material dimension will start to get much more relevant. And this might have massive implications for how political contestation occurs in Western Europe, but also in other society, which boils down to the question that you were doing. What will happen with those who are very, very rich feel threatened? What will happen now if Joe Biden, in fact, it's the most lefty president that the US have had in, I would say, 40 to 50 years in the economic dimension. I mean, this is the joke. I mean, it's Biden, the one who is saying we need more taxation at the international level. It's not social democracy in Europe. I mean, it's the opposite, so to say. But let's imagine now for a second that social democrats in Western Europe will start to be truly social democrats. This means they will push for further taxation and better regulation, and this means that the top 001 will start to be very scared. And this might, in theory, again, we're talking about futurology, might open up the space for different types of constellations that might be not very nice for the democratic system. This is not the case yet, but this is something that in theory could occur, so to say. Now moving to Tanja and the issue of the populist radical right versus the far right, I think that it's true that these are two different party families, and we have evidence on the supply side and also on the demand side. Nevertheless, what is important is far-right parties in Western Europe are almost non-existent. They don't get that many votes. I mean, always Greece is like presented as the exception, but even Golden Dawn, when it gets very, very high, it gets 5 to 6% of the vote, which is not that much. And by the way, if you look at negative partisanship, something that I have been working on, the most hated party in Western Europe, at least for the data that I have, it's Golden Dawn. 80% of people in Greece hate that party, which is a very good sign for liberal democracy within that country. The problem is that populist radical right parties has lower levels of negative partisanship, and this is why they're more threatening, so to say, than the far right. I mean, the far right, don't get me wrong, it's in theory it's much more threatening, but because they don't get that many votes, the threat it's not that big, so to say. But because populist radical right parties are increasing their vote share and are diminishing the size of negative partisanship, I think they're much more relevant than the far right parties, so to say. Regarding neoliberalism, I tend to agree also with your argument that goes back to this Marxist debate, so to say, about what is going on. And I think that what happened in Europe for a long period of time is that this, and I think the US was the same. I mean, the material dimension was not really an issue, so to say, because most parties on the mainstream right, on the mainstream left, agreed that the market is the game in town. You cannot change that. But this is probably going to be an issue in the coming years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a question mark. And if this happens, then might we see further struggling and polarization, not only on the cultural dimension, but also on the material dimension. And finally, regarding Eastern Europe, I'm anything but an expert on Eastern Europe, but I would say that probably you can apply the framework, but with certain caveats. And it's what I would say for Southern Europe. For example, if you want to understand the situation of the mainstream right in Italy and Spain, I would say the framework helps. If you want to understand why voters are supporting certain parties and others, I think it's useful, the framework. But if you want to understand why mainstream right parties started to struggle in countries like Italy and in countries like Spain, I would say it's not related to the twin revolutions. But once these parties start to struggle, then the twin revolutions really matter. And my argument would be that probably for Eastern Europe and other countries of the world, the situation is similar. It could be the case that the crisis of the mainstream right is related to something else, but once the crisis is on board, so to say, the twin revolutions is going to matter about how these different parties are going to defend themselves and which type of issues they're going to present in the electoral arena, and probably that might also travel to the Eastern European continent. And I think I leave it like there so that we still have some time for other comments and questions.
Excellent, Cristóbal. It's just amazing how you managed to respond to all the points Jan-Werner and I have raised in such a succinct way that we still have some time for further questions and comments. So the floor is open. I prefer if you use the chat because then I can see who is first. But if you want to raise your virtual hand, that's okay too. Okay, so floor is open. So I have Misha and then Johannes.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Cristóbal. I had the honor of reading the introduction to the book, and I must say it's extremely fascinating. So congratulations for that. It's really, really important and interesting, I think. I'll try to be brief with my questions, even though I have theoretically a lot of them, but I will pick some of the juiciest ones, I think. And one is short. Do you think there is any connection in your theoretical framework with Katzenmeyer's cartel party thesis? Because I really think that what Professor Müller has also said about the programmatic exhaustion and the erosion of intraparty democracy fits into that cartel party thesis really nicely. So basically, there is a lot of theoretical connection there. The second question is an empirical one. So you showed the graphs where we saw that it is the Christian democratic parties which lost the largest amount of voters compared to conservatives, which lost a bit, and liberals, which didn't lose anybody. So why is that? I didn't really hear a total kind of explanation on that. Is it because Christian Democrats are more cartelized, most pragmatic and less ideologically, profiled, or what is the reason then? And then the third question is, you focused on 4 policy dimensions, but what about the polity dimensions, so to say? So about positions on liberal democracy. So how the positions on liberal democracy of mainstream right parties, have they been changing? You alluded to that, I think, when we talked about different factions in conservative parties, in particular, one liberal, another authoritarian. Is it about the silent revolution versus silent counter-revolution, or is it also about positions on democracy that they have? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Misha. Johannes.
So Cristóbal, thanks a lot for the presentation. Actually, I had not the chance to read the introduction. I'm wondering how all of you got your hands on a copy, but I didn't somehow. So it's based on the presentation that you have, and it bit reminded me in a different field in democratization. Seeblatt making the argument that you should look at conservative parties in democratization processes as well. So that's kind of overlooked. So I really buy your argument here, and I think that's an interesting and needed addition to the literature. So I congratulate you on this. I'm wondering when you discussed your concepts, or let me put it this way: was there a debate among you and the other contributors, if you would call it the conservative party family, also as Siebert and others would do, you know, call it more conservative, and you call it mainstream right. And the way you define right is to say that what was it, natural inequalities are accepted within society, and even with reference to religion and so on. I think it would change if you would define, you know, if you would use the umbrella term of conservative parties somehow. So then you could argue more it's kind of favoring the status quo over progress, or more pragmatic approaches, this kind of experimental idea and so on. So which would also make it natural that they are very moderate somehow in their program. And I was wondering why you choose mainstream right. And then I was wondering, but I'm not too familiar with this distinction. Maybe you could say something how you distinguish between Christian democracy and conservatives. This seems to be extremely close to me, at least from a German standpoint. But it could be that it's kind of a well-established distinction. Do have a lot of other points, but let me focus only on one more that would be interesting to me on party systems. So not only how many parties there are, but more about the party dynamics. Maybe Sartori type of centrifugal or centripetal dynamics within party systems. Was that something that loomed prominent in your explanations? Because I could imagine, so that would be something that I would expect to appear there as well. So maybe I leave it here. Thank you.
Cristóbal, in the interest of time, I have two more people on the list, Hans-Jürgen and Alexandra Paulin. I would take the two and then give it back to you. Is that okay? So, Hans-Jürgen.
Okay, thank you. Just 2 points. One goes to Jan-Werner. I found that among your points, you almost exclusively referred to Christian democratic parties as mainstream right parties. Would your points sound differently at one or the other point if you would look at all of them? We know that at least 3 big countries, which are important, in France, Great Britain, and Spain, the majoritarian right parties are not Christian democratic. Then, with regard to Cristóbal's exposition, I wonder whether you could show us the index so we could see the logic of how the book is organized, and particularly the logic along which lines the comparative chapters are written. I hope you have more comparative chapters in it than country chapters. This is a big problem with books like that, of course, so that we could see where your attention particularly is focused. In the beginning, you presented some quite meaningless data, as we know, because they were completely aggregated. The interesting thing is not the aggregation. The more you aggregate in these kinds of trends and tendencies of voting, the less meaningful the content becomes. Because the important thing here in this topic, I think, are the different constellations of party contestation. Not only the party families are different, and their trajectories are different, and the welfare states are different, and many other things, not to speak of the political systems and the electoral systems, but also the parameters of party contestation are different. The size and impact of the Greens, for example, in the particular countries are different. The same applies to the right-wing populists, and also the patterns of the decline of social democracies follow different trajectories, which not only have to do with the different types of the social democrats. So to make it short, what about typological aspects you might have derived for your conclusion?
Okay, last but not least, Alex, you got the floor.
Thanks so much. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm very excited to do so. I had a kind of specific question, which I hope has sort of broader implications while you were presenting, I kept thinking about the Conservative Party in Britain. And you mentioned right at the end of your presentation that there is this possibility of kind of blurring the line between a mainstream and a populist party. And it seems to me that the Conservative Party in the UK is already doing that to a really large extent. They're very good at mobilising this rhetoric of the people versus the elites. They absorbed the populist cause of Brexit to the extent, I mean, I understand that their absorption and their embracing of that issue was fractious, gradual, problematic in some ways, but they nevertheless have ended up absorbing it to the extent that their populist right-wing challenger party, the United Kingdom Independence Party, has actually kind of died. So in that sense, the Conservative Party in the UK really seems to kind of disrupt this framework of populist versus mainstream, both because it seems to kind of cross this divide, but also because the Conservative Party has been able to embrace a populist issue as an opportunity, not simply as a threat, but as an opportunity, and has now kind of consolidated these electoral gains in a very large majority. And I wondered how you kind of respond to that, and what some of those issues are. And then I also just wanted to highlight a really small point. You mentioned that the Conservatives seem sometimes to be this party that are kind of in search of an identity, in search of values. I think it might be more helpful to read the Conservatives as the Conservative ideological flexibility as itself a permanent feature. You know, I don't think necessarily that they're going to kind of settle down and absorb a set of values. I think actually the flexibility which they've shown has been a feature of their politics for perhaps 200 years or so, and it's actually made them a kind of phenomenal election-winning machine. Those are my points.
Excellent point. It always helps to bring into historical perspective. Okay, Cristóbal, back to you. And we are doing really good in time, so I think this works very well. And Jan-Werner, you will also get the opportunity to respond to Hans-Jürgen's point if you like, if you have anything to say. But now, Cristóbal.
Okay, many thanks again for comments, questions, and observation, and I will try to deal with each of them, most of them. I mean, to Michael first, the issue of why Christian democracy. So why is it that in the graph that I presented, you see that the decline of Christian democratic parties? And of course, and this is a bit related to the issue that Jan-Werner was saying, that Hans-Jürgen was saying, it's always difficult when you add the data for different countries. So it might be that you're hiding something, because it could be, for example, that it's one country that is driving the whole thing, or it could be there are different things happening. And this is why we try to have, on the one hand, these large case studies that try to present the overall picture, but at the same time, we have some individual case studies, country case studies, in which you can try to find out whether there are certain similarities or differences. Nevertheless, when it comes to the Christian democratic parties, and if I think here about the chapters on the Netherlands or Austria and Germany, something that is very clear, it's related to religiosity. I mean, these were countries in which religion was very relevant before the silent revolution, so to say, and started to lose traction over time. And it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why Christian democratic parties are struggling to have a loyal base of support, so to say. This would be the general argument, I would say, for Christian democratic parties. But at the same time, and this relates again to the argument of Hans-Jürgen, there are also national stories in between, so to say. If you want to understand what is going on in Germany, of course, this is related to the Green Party and how the political space has been moving. And in fact, we know that the profile of those who support the Green Party nowadays, a part of them, not all of them, were people that were voting for the Christian Democratic Party before. So the challenge for the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, so to say, is not only the silent counter-revolution, so the AfD, but at the same time, it's the silent revolution. And as Jan-Werner was saying, it's this pragmatic position of not having ideology is steering the party into different dimensions, into different factions, so to say, in terms of the voters, of where do they move. Regarding the issue of the cartel party thesis, I think it's a nice argument. And to be honest, we didn't develop that in the framework, but if we start thinking about many of the individual case studies, you will start realizing that many of the challenges that mainstream right parties are suffering in these individual countries, and the mainstream right in particular, it's related to the cartel party thesis. And this goes back to something that we were discussing before. On the one hand, this is neoliberal dimension. One of the arguments of Katz and Mayer is a cartel party thesis leaves depoliticize the economic dimension, so to say, and this means that political parties don't compete on that dimension anymore. And the second aspect of the Carter hypothesis that I think that applies for the findings of that book is that once parties start to be funded by the state, the way in which they relate to their constituencies changes dramatically, because they really need to have good spin doctors and have relatively good electoral results, not necessarily having a huge base of support that have a connection to the party. And that's changed the way in which parties are structured. And this probably goes back to this issue of the different factions. And when you have a leader that is in favor of the silent counter-revolution, can very easily move the party into that direction and the other direction. And this is probably related to this overall transformation of the party system as a whole. The third point that you develop about the positions on liberal democracy, this is something that we didn't address not really implicitly, but I would say much more explicitly, in the sense that when we ask our contributors for the different case studies to look at the challenges, these are these 4 policy challenges that I mentioned in the presentation and a part of the book. But of course, part of the story that we wanted to hear is to what extent these mainstream right parties still commit to the Liberal Democratic Party, to the liberal democratic system or not. And one of the problems that we find out by looking at the comparative evidence is that some of those parties are behaving in an awkward way, and this is what we call this ersatz version of the populist radical right. And this probably connects a bit to what Alexandra was saying for the UK, that is an example of that. These are parties that I will still, if you look at the empirical data, so to say, these are parties that are still mainstream right parties. But if I look at the behavior and the discourse of the leader of the party, they're getting very, very similar to the populist radical right. And this is why one of the issues that we mentioned in our book, we need to observe these cases in particularly, not only those cases, but these cases in particularly, how they are going to evolve over time. And this is important if we look at evidence beyond Western Europe. And Jan-Werner knows the case of Hungary very well, for example, but Orban was not a populist radical right politician. He was a mainstream right politician. If you think about Erdogan in Turkey, he was seen as a sort of a Christian democratic model for a Muslim society, and then he transformed into a populist radical right force. And I think that sort of challenge, we think, oh, this is something that is happening beyond Western Europe, but I think it might be already happening within Western Europe. If you think about Boris Johnson, if you think about Mark Rutte, and if you think about Kurz, I think the situation is not as dramatic as Hungary and not dramatic as Turkey or as Brazil with Bolsonaro. But again, we need to be careful about how we use these conceptual tools, so to say, when analyzing those cases. And this is why we need more research about that. Now to Johannes, one of the issues that we really relate to in our book, it's the argument of Daniel Ziblatt, of course, and we say, if we want to bring back this agenda, it's important to analyze against mainstream right party, not only because they govern, but also because they are crucial for the survival of the democratic system. And here, for example, I think the Italian case study is fascinating. I think Jan-Werner mentioned that on passing, I think. Imagine you're a right-wing voter in Italy. The problem that you have as a right-wing voter in Italy is that there is no mainstream right party anymore. So, because in fact, Silvio Berlusconi was the sort of functional equivalent of that, and he's disappearing. So, and this means if you're a right-wing voter now, you either vote for the Lega, which is a populist radical right, or you vote for the other party is competing with the Lega, which is another populist radical right party. But if you're a right-winger, and if you believe in the argument about negative partisanship, that at least I believe, you will not vote for the left. So the only option at hand is voting for populist radical right parties, because the mainstream right party disappeared in that country. And I think this is one of the main challenges that I see. Many mainstream right politicians think that the way ahead is building an ersatz version of the populist radical right. And that might be a smart move in the short run, but I think in the long term, it's probably a killer. Once you have tried Coke, you don't want to have Pepsi. I think that's a problem. Once you start to politicize the issue of immigration, and you say that's the selling point, that's what Sarkozy tried to do, then you will say, why should I go to the moderate version? I go to the really hardcore one. And I think this is what these parties are not really understanding. And this is a bit similar to the story of social democracy, but the flip side. If you remember, the whole argument about Schroeder and Blair was, let's move to the center, and through that way, we'll be able to govern. And they will be able to do it in the short term. But in the long term, they killed social democratic parties. And I think could happen exactly the same to the mainstream right, but in the other direction. If you move too much to the radical position, those liberal voters, there is a moment in time that you will say, I don't identify with that party anymore, because this party transformed into something else. And this is the danger for that party in the long term, so to say. But if those parties are able to control the government, this is a real problem for the liberal democratic system. Regarding the issue of the conceptualizations, I think we prefer the concept of the mainstream right because it's a bit of a broader umbrella for including these three different party families. I would say that including conservative and Christian Democrats within the mainstream right camp is not very problematic if you look at the literature. And Christian Democratic parties have normally two big differences to conservative parties. The first one is that they're very in favor of the European integration process. They have been the motor behind that, if you want. And this is not really the story of conservative parties. And second is a very peculiar model of the welfare state, the Christian Democratic welfare state, to say that is different from the conservative party family. But nevertheless, they are part of the mainstream right. The liberal party family is the one that is more tricky. Because if we go back to the issue of the two dimensions, you have liberal parties that can be very right-wingers on the market dimension and can be at the same time very right-winger or left-winger on the cultural dimension. And this is why the liberal party family, in theory, I would say, yes, it's part of the mainstream right, but you need to look much more at each of the specific cases to better understand to what extent they are really mainstream or in which aspects they are mainstream and in which aspects are not. And this probably also relates to the figure. If you remember, the Liberal Party family is very stable over time. And I think that the Liberal Party family, particularly because it has some room of maneuver for moving either to the left or to the right in these two dimensions, gives them some space, so to say, to position themselves into this changing territory. And this is an opportunity that they have, but depends again on the different case studies. I mean, the case of France is fascinating. I mean, you have Macron, who started from the scratch, and he's governing the country. I don't know for how long, but he's governing the country. And this is an example of a liberal that it's a right-winger on the economic dimension, but it's left-winger on the liberal dimension, if you want. Finally, you will say in party systems and institutions, the whole argument about party systems, I would say yes, but. I mean, one of the interesting issues is that we compare, at least in our 8 case studies, countries that have very different party systems and have very different electoral systems. I mean, the UK and Spain have electoral systems that are very different from the Netherlands and Germany. But overall, the argument that we developed seems to hold true for all these different cases. Of course, if you want to understand at the end of the day why in some cases it's more acute than in others, electoral systems and party system matters, I would say. But the overall picture of the theory that we develop, I think, goes beyond this institutional argument. But I think the institutional argument, of course, is crucial to understand how these different countries or mainstream right parties within the parties have been changing in different directions. Finally, to Hans-Jürgen, I mean, this is an old debate between comparativists, what is better and which type of evidence. You go for the country cases, you go for the large picture. And as Jan-Werner was saying, doing these edited volumes, it's great, but it's also very tough because on the one hand, you have your own theoretical framework. To be completely honest, I don't have enough knowledge for writing 8 chapters for 8 different country cases in Western Europe. I need the knowledge of experts on these country cases, but as Jan-Werner was saying, I don't want to tell me, this is a story that you have to tell me. I also tell them, look, this is the idea that I have, but please tell me to what extent it works or not, and which are the peculiarities of each of these country cases. And this is the balance that we try to do. And at the same time, we include the general argument in these 2 large case studies with the demand side and the supply side. And there is no apologies. Maybe during the discussion, there was a lot of debate on Christian democracy, but the evidence goes beyond Christian democratic parties. We have debate on the liberal and the conservative party family as well. And finally, to Alexandra, I think in part I already answered your question, but I think the case of Johnson and the UK, it's fascinating and it's one of the most problematic because of that. Because I would say, if I would, as a non-UK expert, and at least that's what the chapter tells me from a UK expert, tells me the Conservative Party is still a mainstream right party. But the question mark of that chapter is, will the party continue to be that in the near future? And this is an open question. It depends a lot on how Johnson will react and what will happen after Johnson. I mean, the legacies of those figures can be very contested. And this is something that we need to keep in mind, again, when analyzing those parties. Are mainstream right parties, yes or no? And this, again, it's really related to the way in which they relate to the liberal democratic system. And I end here, so that Jan still have a few minutes to say something.
Just amazing. Okay, Jan-Werner, is there anything you want to add?
I don't want to keep us, but maybe 2 points because Hans-Jürgen Poole directly also addressed me. So I agree that some of the trends I was speculating about are more evident in the case of Christian democracy, though I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the kind of, for lack of a better term, programmatic / ideological boost that at least some conservatives got with neoliberalism, which was never just the kind of, greed is good philosophy, but had a kind of moral dimension, and which allowed these parties to offer a distinctive vision. I think that's now very clearly exhausted, and that's certainly true in the United States. Secondly, I think it is also important what Alexandra said about sort of seeing the longer historical picture here, and bearing in mind that both Christian Democrats Christian Democrats always have this promise of we are mediating. So we are in the business of creating a pluralistic and in a sense harmonious society. So when people say, "Oh, Angela Merkel, selling out Christian democracy," they tend to forget that her kind of moderating, mediating, I'm going to bring everything together approach, at least on the level of method, is actually very Christian democratic. And the same, of course, to some degree also for at least some conservative parties, which in a sort of Burkean spirit always said, "Oh yeah, the whole point is to adapt very carefully to changing circumstances," which maybe also leads us to think that, okay, it can be easy to underestimate the capacity of these parties and associations to kind of reinvent themselves. So therefore, it's like always, it's too early to declare the end of something, it's all over, etc., etc. Anyway, that's all I would say.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jan-Werner. There's one thing I'd like to add, again, referring to Alex's point about the flexibility of conservative parties, right, throughout history. I'm not sure whether it's flexibility, it's certainly, or whether it's their traditional ambivalence towards liberalism, which makes them the most frequent coalition partner of radical populist parties in the European Parliament, the ERC, right? Particularly not only on European integration issues, but on what you refer to as moral issues. So this we have this paper. We've done a paper on voting cohesion of radical populist party, populist radical right parties in the European Parliament that shows, again, their most likely coalition partner or alliance is with the conservatives, not the Christian democratic parties, right? So I think there is something to be said here. Okay, Cristóbal, time's up. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. We covered a lot of ground in a little bit more than 90 minutes. I think this is testifies to your excellent intellectual capacities, and not only to the fact that you've written or published a very nice book, edited a very nice book, but also you have accommodated and responded to a lot of our, actually all of our comments and questions. So thank you all, particularly to you, Jan-Werner, for your discussion, but also to the others who participated in the discussion. Of course, thanks to you, Cristóbal, for sharing this book. It's out, right? So you can actually
will be out in any second. So
in any second.
July.
Okay.
I don't know if July it's the beginning or the end, but
Okay.
should be very soon.
So watch out for the book. And with that, I just want to remind you that in a few minutes there is a workshop starting, organized by Jan-Werner, on populism and its impact on all kinds of, on international politics. And he essentially walks us through different issue areas. So for those of you who are interested, you're most welcome to attend. So other than that, take care, have a good rest of the week, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Hi, thank you.